here for the storm. Um, I only have 12 hands marked today from the volunteer union. Go ahead and shout yourself out in the chat so that everybody knows who you are. Normally I'll mark more hands than this, but I'm at a point right now where I felt like this specific batch of hands was really relevant to like really drive a point home to a particular group or demographic of players that I felt like this player somewhat represents. I don't know his game. I'm seeing a batch of hands, so in a lot of ways I'm biased with directing the momentum of this lesson where I will. But this will be probably one of the hardest love lessons I'll ever give on the stream. And the reason that I'm doing it is because I think that if I can do it in a way that gets through to even a couple of you, where I can make points to blast through the insistence that's been keeping you from changing, then it's worth it. And there's a whole bunch of you who seem to think you understand why you haven't got to that high stakes level yet where you're crushing and just really consistent as a player, yet month after month, year after year, you're not doing it. So there comes a point where, as someone who's gone through that cycle many times over the course of my 20s, I feel like the suggestion I can offer is to stop doing it to yourself. Like, change faster than I did so that you don't have to go through the iterations of futility that eventually leave you to the same place, which is where you'll eventually change, but you'll do it out of basically cliff jumping away from all of the pain you cause yourself with over insistence. So it's really your choice. And I say this to a lot of younger guys too, where it's like, you know, you're young, you have the opportunity to fuck around where it's not really that problematic for your overall life. It'll cause you stress if you're not getting the results you want, but ultimately, like, no one expects anything of you until you're like 30 or so. So you have this luxury of experimenting a lot. Except what a lot of young 20-year-olds do is they believe themselves to be in an experimental pattern, but really they're applying a level of insistence that's just redundant and unintelligent. So my advice to the young guys, or to the guys who are aware and humble enough to admit that I have not been progressing at the rate that I have wished or set out to, it's time to really sit down and show some humility towards what I'm about to say, because I promise you, some aspect of it is relevant to you. Even if the whole thing is not, like, even if every angle of it doesn't exactly speak to you, there's going to be a nugget from this 45 or hour session where I basically just rip through insistence, where you'll walk away with like something you can hold on to, like, that's what I'm going to apply in the next week or two. That felt true and resonated with me, and I haven't been honest enough with myself in that department, and that's where I want my focus to be. So I've been sitting here for the last 10 minutes trying to think how I want to approach this, because I only have 12 hands, and I'm coming off of a session last night with a student where I marked 25 of his hands, and we ran through them pretty quickly, and there was a sort of back and forth between us just at a glance with these hands, where it was like some of them we agreed on, some of them there was an insistence coming from the student on the level of, yes, but this condition. Don't get me wrong, a lot of hands that I might mark are conditional, especially with what we have now in terms of the volatility metrics, which is player profiling, where sometimes doing something versus a player is obviously okay, where versus another player profile would be a mistake. That type of stuff happens often, and when I'm marking hands, I try to pay attention to if we're playing someone who's a fish, because it changes things a good deal. But when I start to see certain patterns arising from the student where he's applying levels of insistence, challenging the hands that I'm marking in a way that is coming from a high level of assumption, that's when I notice this overall personality pattern that really needs to be addressed. So the lesson I did last night that I'm referring to was probably one of the most different, and I don't really know how to explain it. Like, in a way, I want to say it was very potent because it's like so hard hitting, like it's such hard love. And if the student trusts me that where I'm speaking from is a pure suggestion that comes from my own experience, like the thing that I hope I conveyed last night in that session is you're talking to someone who used to do all this shit and that it didn't work out for. And if you think you tried as many ways as I did to make it work out with all of the creative aggression, that's mainly what I'm referring to, or just all of the insistent notions about what this guy's range looked like in this spot and why this was an okay call or bet. If you think I haven't worked through that in my 20s way harder than you because my work ethic was better than you, but my insistence was even greater than yours. So if you think I haven't been through that, I know you're being very arrogant because I know very few people who had the work ethic that I had in my 20s. And I feel for you in the sense that I know what type of pain you're going to go through if you continue with that pattern for the next few years or however long it takes until you reach that point of emotional leverage where you completely burn out with whatever amount of work ethic you're applying and you either quit poker and continue to fuck up your life in other departments, other ventures that you go into, or you'll get to that point where you surrender and stick with poker, but do it in a more intuitively guided, less insistent way. So my hope is that you take some advice and you speed up your journey because you're not doing anything for yourself by forging ahead into territory where I'm so certain you're being over insistent. So what I'm going to try to do from an objective point of view is really try to illuminate where the resistance is over assumptive, where that level of insistence is not coming from any sort of objective, quantifiable metrics. That's one of the main things. And if I can do that, if I can show you that the hands that you are insistent about, like, no, this hand shouldn't be marked. This hand's actually correct because these conditions were in place. If I can show you that your assumptions on why the hand is conditionally correct are actually really biased, then I have some sort of metric to work with where I can be like, do you see what you're doing to yourself? Do you see that this insistence that you're applying is in the wrong direction? Okay, so what I'm going to do first and foremost is play through these hands. I'm going to sort of repeat the pattern that I did with the student last night, where we just ran through the hands at a glance, and I asked him a simple question. I said, I want you to pay attention to a pattern that you see developing in these hands. So I'm going to let these play out. I'm not going to say anything, and we're going to watch these 12 hands, and I want you guys to sense into a pattern. And when I say a pattern, I mean an overall mentality issue that is reoccurring, or if you want to try to group certain hands together and come up with maybe 2 or 3 patterns, it'll be helpful for where I'm going to go next. So let's just all be quiet for a minute and watch some hands. This new guy that just joined the stream is gonna be like, what the fuck? We don't do any talking in these streams. Thanks, Rank Zero. What's your question? So I'm going to ask Unier first. Out of these 12 hands, if you had to summarize a pattern that you see going on, what would it be? One or two general statements you could make about the tendencies arising in these type of hands that I've marked. And if you can't identify it, that's fine. But I want to ask first and foremost because it can help generate a context around the lesson if you go first here. Okay, he says, I see too much calling, 3-bet calls too, and also too much forced aggression. And I think that's really on point with what I'm sensing too. Now, while I answer Rank Zero's question, are there any hands, I'm going to play through the batch at a higher pace, are there any hands here that you really feel defensive about that should not be marked in the batch? Call them out if there are. Rank Zero said, I was being super honest the last few weeks about my game and I found that I need priorities and focus in one major thing. After 10 to 20k hands for review, I've made one big HM2 note, which is called emotional decision making. But now, how do I proceed to start to clear the neglect and mistakes now? That's really cool. It's actually the same direction that I've sort of circled back on with the CFP Flight 1 program in terms of recognizing that one of the biggest things that I didn't pay enough attention to early on was integration of standard line metrics. It's something that's connecting to what's going on in Unier's hands right here too. A lot of his forced aggression and just sloppiness in general is coming from not having a good enough understanding of standard line metrics. And there's still rationalization occurring in game, over analysis, assumptive ranging, that's causing him to be inconsistent. So this is what I mean. It's usually one of the main things that I see in an insistent type of player is we'll do a hand review, and then he'll have 10 hands out of the 25 in the batch. That's what occurred in the lesson last night, where he would like to argue that he has assumptive ranging reasons that are well balanced for why he made the call or bet or fold that he did. That looks strange to me. Like, in no way can I say that all these hands that I marked are mistakes, but there are things that stand out to me that either A, don't appear in the standard line metrics of winning players, meaning you're literally taking lines that should be taken at very low frequencies because they're just not winning lines. We know that because we've done a lot of data research through like stuff like the night vision pack, where over 30 million, 50 million, 100 million hand samples, we know lines that do not produce any sort of dramatic exploitative fold equity, for instance, in the terms of forcing aggression. We know lines that are under bluffed. So if you're finding yourself in these lines consistently, the question I have is, what's your support for it? And then the student will give some sort of reasoning, and then usually that, since that reasoning is not rooted in any sort of quantifiable data points, it's highly assumptive. So what ends up happening with these types of students is you play this runaround with them where they would like to say this is an objective truth, where actually it's just a projection of their own assumption that they just keep on overlaying into their game, and they're living in like a futile fantasy world of assumption, bias assumption. And this is why I think it's so important to approach this from like a really direct, single-pointed, hard love focus with these type of players, because if that guy's arguing with 10 out of 25 marked hands every time he comes to a lesson, and he's not trusting the coach to make a correction there just even based on faith alone, if that student does not want to take the suggestion and continues to insistently apply his own level of assumption, those 10 out of 25 hands perpetuate themselves forever. And the student will incur the win rate loss of believing that he's justified in those spots when actually he's just being overly insistent. So this works actually much better with guys who don't have a win rate yet, or guys who are marginally good, marginal win rate winners, I guess you could say. Like the guy that has the 3 BB per 100 win rate, and he's not being really super incentivized to look at his game in a really honest way because he's winning and he's relatively endorsed by the feedback he's getting from his environment that his assumptions are not all that biased. That guy will look at the 9 out of 25 that he has insistent feelings about and be like, I don't really need to change these. It's very simple to rationalize that. But if he continues to do that, he will be the type of player that will not rise through the ranks because those 9 out of 25 are not acceptable to exist in your game if you want to be crushing high stakes. So, to get back to what the question was, how do I begin to integrate the things that I need to integrate? You need to put emphasis first on standard line metrics. Standard line metrics are aspects of a winning system that are frequently occurring and can be integrated through pattern recognition. This is a lot of what we were doing in the night vision course. And I think where I'm headed, just my gut tells me that I never really know, but the direction of the feedback that I get off of my environment, which is my major direction now, and by my environment, I'm basically mean the network of guys that are active in coaching with me, and also what I see in the public forums in terms of what's being requested by the community. Where I see my private sector going is a synergy of all of my courses so far, where somehow I'm able to basically condense everything into something much more pattern recognized and much more, is this a word, curriculum? Why am I asking you? You're fucking Slovenian. Your vocabulary is shit. A curriculum of, a curriculum of like lessons that a student can go with. And one of the guys on CFP is really helping me with this because he's much better at contextualizing stuff in that like webinar format. But something like that seems like it's on the tip of my tongue, and it seems to be sort of coming together through all of the work that we're doing with the network, that when I do something like a CFP program, it's like they're giving you a lot of feedback of what doesn't work in an archived course. Basically, we have a lot of stuff in an archive, but we're getting feedback that the reason that it's not being integrated is because it's not distilled enough and it's not organized enough so that it's not able to be trained repetitively enough. So what we need now is to go deeper, more micro, more organized, more distilled, so that we can plot a more deliberate curriculum for these guys to enter the course, know exactly what the hell they have to do every day in terms of banging out study, and then hit the tables with the pattern recognition they've integrated from these things. So standard line metrics is one of the first things I want to introduce in the course. It's like, let me get you familiar with the winning lines that are half theoretical and simplified, well-balanced strategies, and then the other half are incentivized by all of the mass database imbalances that we've detected through all of the research that we've done, quantifiable, backed up, standard line winning metrics that the student can feel good about, pattern recognize, go in, still relatively raw, but at least be implementing something that he feels sturdy with. That's what I want for like step one. So that would be my advice to you right now, because it seems like that's sort of the level you're on, and it's cool that you've done this independently, and the reason that you've been able to do that is because you function from a level of honesty that's sort of committed to that path, which I think is really cool. So your gut has told you, I need to be more honest, and let's chalk up all the things that have been confusing me, or where I feel I've been neglecting the progress of my own path. And so you have this collection or this little library that you've put together, and it's all the things that you're not sure about. Now your process needs to be to distill that into patterns, groupings, and by that I mean chunk it so that you have what I'm about to do here. Like, what are the patterns that are occurring? And Junior said it's forced aggression, I'm calling down too much in certain spots, and I have certain pre-flop leaks. Those are the general inconsistencies. So try to detect where your inconsistencies are, then work to create libraries where you group marked hands that relate to those inconsistencies. And this is not going to be totally easy to do if you still function from a certain level of assumption, but this is what I did when I went off on the independent path, and I didn't have any super high tier coach telling me, okay, yeah, Nick, this is right and this is wrong and this is right. Basically, I just kind of practitionered it and toggled through the environment, getting feedback along the way, and eventually calibrated toward what I think is a pretty well-balanced approach now. And when I say well-balanced, I don't mean I'm playing theory optimal. I mean I'm responding correctly to the incentives of my environment. So that would be my overall advice is trust yourself to create a library where you can chunk your patternized confusion or leaks, anywhere where you sense that there's an inconsistency in your thought process, chunk that, put it into a collection of hands that create a pattern, and then challenge yourself to expose the bias over and over again by voicing your thought process in that spot. You can do a lot through that. I've mentioned an exercise where you can literally sit down with a headset and voice over all of the data point recognition that you see in a grouping of hands that correlate to each other, then walk away, half hour later come back and do it again. If you do it 2 or 3 times, what you'll have is a hyper analysis by the 3rd time, where it's been the synergy of all the good shit from the first 2. You'll notice that your mind is clarifying itself as you go back over it in iterations. And then you take the 3rd recording, and that's the one you wake up to the next day and listen to first. Then you do it again. So what you end up with is like this upward spiral of your best self thought process where you're constantly balancing assumption, and you'll know when you hit a balanced place. Like, the more sensitive you get to this process in the independent path, it's like the more you're able to see where there's contradictions in your own thought process, and that's the indicator that you've reached a balance. I've said before in the stream that a lot of guys who aren't on the independent intuitive path, they distrust that they can identify when they've reached a subjective point of balance in their own assumption. In other words, we've been trained to basically distrust ourselves all over the place, but you actually do get a resonant tone when you hit a perspective that's coming from a very balanced place. And that was what I trained myself to follow in the intuitive process. And I like saying it like that because I don't think it's a way that I've expressed it before. And while it is sort of still a little bit abstract, it's the best I can do because this is essentially about, if you're going to plow into experimental territory, essentially it is about trust in the end, because there needs to be something tangible or objective, and for me it's that resonant tone, it's that harmony that I get in my energy system, my body mind, where it's like, oh yeah, I don't sense that there's a contradiction going on here, and that means that I must have reached a higher level of balance in this assumption. And then I follow that path until I see that there's a discord in it, and then I reassess from a place of humility, and then I course correct, recalibrate, and keep going forward. So this entire process is about forging ahead into the resonance of your own assumptive pattern, I think, at least. Okay, so going back to this lesson, how does that relate to everything? Junior has identified that there's basically three things that he thinks he's doing wrong. He thinks he's forcing aggression, he thinks he has inconsistencies and potentially calling too much, and he noticed some pre-flop spew. I'm going to go through real quick, and based on a combination of general psychology, standard line metrics that I just know to be consistent patterns of winning players, you might hear me say a term like, this is a violation of a standard line metric. That means that this is an inconsistent line that if it really doesn't have sound backup for it, like if the student cannot give really good reasons for why he deviated from a standard line metric and did something unorthodox with a line, then I have to sort of challenge the assumption of it and be like, how are you backing this up? Or do you have data points for this that are quantifiable? Like, have you done mass database research to say that people are overfolding these lines? Do you have advanced textural analysis that proves that? You probably don't if it's occurring on the turn in the river, because we really don't have sample sizes to support that stuff. It's pretty hard to get. So those are the main two. It'll be general psychology, it'll be standard line metrics, and then it'll be more of a sense of like that forced aggression thing. Like, again, do you really have a good reason for this, or are you just sort of like flying by the seat of your pants? So I'm going to go through, and this is what I see when I'm marking something. When I go through a storm, like, I'm doing it really fast. Sometimes I'll go back and on a really tricky hand, I'll go and I'll play the action 2 or 3 times, or if I lose the action, I'll have to do that. But for the most part, I want to fly above the level of my own analysis because it's my subconscious integration that I trust the most. So what I'm looking for is inconsistency and pattern recognition, and those are the hands that I'll mark. And probably 90% of the time, I'm pretty accurate with just that system. So I remember a long time ago I saw something written about Isildur where he said that he always wants, and I guess people could argue that he's like a really good player or whatnot. I really don't know like what his long-term results are, but like if it's true that he's a gifted player, one interesting thing that he said was, I never go against my first gut feeling, and I try to make my action very fast so that I don't rationalize against my subconscious. So that's what I do very much so when I'm marking hands, because it's that first run through that I get a batch, and then sometimes I'll go through it again and I'll refine it. So let me show you what I do here. I'm going to contextualize it a little bit more by speaking in very deliberate terminology for what I'm seeing in a certain hand. I'm going to go back into some of these concepts. Like this hand, you're going to hear me say the term perceived range awareness. Our range is not perceived as capped. We have a bunch of 10x. That's very important. This guy's also potting it, bet size data point, and we're defending with a weak bluff catcher. So perceived range awareness is the crucial data point in that hand, along with bet size tell. This hand is a spot where it's assumptive to believe that this guy is polarizing a natural range that has enough bluffs. It's highly assumptive to think that he turns hands like ace king and ace queen into bluffs at a high enough frequency to justify this call. Most guys who play this line are severely imbalancing their check call range, and it doesn't polarize naturally on future streets. This is a check call, check check, reopen. This is a call pre-flop because of stack depth. And then we call pot size bet in a bet check bet line that I think is just notoriously underbluffed. Same thing here. I don't think he's going to turn ace king and ace queen into a bluff. And it goes against basic general psychology to be betting, checking, then potting with the type of range construction that he's going to have here, middle position versus UTG. here we're bluffing a blocker bet. It might be from a fish. I think that there's just a violation of a metric here. This isn't something that's included in the program that I train with because it's too volatile by nature, meaning that we don't have good enough indications that this gets through often enough as a bluff. Half the time you're doing it, you're dealing with a volatile fish who's blocker betting and just blindly calling off with whatever merge thing he's doing it with. And then clearly there's an assumption if you think that he's so capped here that he'll never be able to call because, I mean, this is a pretty good indication that he's not capped. I know I'm being results oriented, but if the reason to raise is that the opponent's capped, realize that that only works for us the type of reg who's not capable of recognizing that he's playing a capped line and then capable of just pressing call. So there's almost a level of arrogance that's injected into a play like this because, and this functions on paradigm awareness, that like this only really works against the guy who like is so straightforward that he's not aware he's capping himself and then he overfolds substantially. And I'm not saying it's like substantially losing, but I don't see that it's like crazy winning, and it makes me wonder, why are you bothering? Some guys would be like, well, I want to try to play such well-balanced strategies, but you're not going to be able to do that anyway because that's also super arrogant. So don't just go around bluff raising pocket sixes here because you want to justify at the end of the day that you play more well-balanced strategies. Let's actually focus on what's incentivized by the environment, because I doubt, especially it looks like you're playing on an anon site, that you have history enough with any of these guys to justify well-balanced strategies. So this I would just feel is classified as forced aggression, and if the student can't present quantifiable data points as to why it's incentivized through a lot of black and white research, I'm talking like millions of hands of research that says that this line gets overfolded when they block or bet on the river, then you should just be avoiding it because it's not helping you. The very fact, I told this to the student last night, the very fact that you don't have a good enough reason for why you're forcing aggression. Like when I ask you, what's the data point? And if you just be like, well, he's capped. Well, he's clearly not as capped as you think. And even if he was, he's still required to fold the capped range. Sense into the level of assumption that projects that you know exactly how he's going to respond in this spot. And then if you don't have anything else to back that up that says, hey, look at these numbers, they actually are folding way too much, now we have to have a sit down where you have a moment with yourself that recognizes your own arrogance. And then you have a chance, if you become available in that moment, to make an upgrade towards higher levels of humility and be like, wow, I actually am forcing something that I don't have a good rationalization for here. There is a level of bias going on in me. And even if I can't prove, like even if there's no proof that what I'm saying is right, that this is negative EV, the very fact that the student can't produce an objective reason for it, a well-balanced, empirically driven reason for it, that should be enough. This is what I said to the student last night. This really hit home with him, so listen up. I said, is it enough for you to see that I've basically exposed that you don't have a good enough reason for this other than the projection of how you think this maps based on your history of playing poker and how you think people respond? Other than how you think the game works, you don't have any sort of empirically driven reasons for doing what you're doing. And he's like, yeah, I can admit that. It's just my gut. When really, your gut wouldn't do that because your gut doesn't function on assumption. Your gut, again, resonates with balance and non-assumption. So what this is an over-insistence of trying to reinforce the paradigm that's been asserted and has a momentum from your past, from however you were trained to think about the game. So if you can get to that point where you're like, wow, I'm actually being controlled by an aspect that has no empirically driven support. Get there, and then you can see that even if I don't have proof either way that this is negative EV, I can at least admit that I don't want to be controlled by something that's compulsive by nature. I don't want to be controlled by an aspect of myself that has poorly balanced reasons for why it takes action. And that's why I suggest you take the more humble route, which tends to be the more conservative route in these spots, and just pick the zero EV play over forcing aggression. This is just too thin with a one card straight on board. Just a range versus range interaction misunderstanding. That one's pretty simple. This I think is actually a spewy c-bet, but it's a subtle range versus range texture thing. Queen 9 X is actually going to smack his range here enough that I don't even think you deserve to be checked. I don't even think that you really should be c-betting. Like, especially since it's cutoff versus big blind, not a lot of guys will play a really wide. Like, the type of guy who's going to play a really wide call versus 4-bet is probably going to fuck around post-flop enough to make you regret c-betting ace-king. The type of guy who's playing a tight call versus 4-bet is probably going to connect with his flop at a frequency that's going to make you regret playing ace-king. And then there's everything in between, none of which really feels great to me for c-betting, especially when you face volatility profiles who will go ahead and check raise merge and shit, and now you've slashed your throat in terms of your realization of this hand. So I would probably just check back this flop, but this is a more subtle type thing, and that's what I'm talking about. Results for the win. This is a violation of a metric. This is a bet check bet line in a spot where your range is quite well protected. So again, perceived range awareness, that goes back from to hand one. I really just don't think that a player who's not super volatile in his profile is going to be reopening here with enough bluffs, because I just don't think it's a runoff that's perceived as better for his range than yours, and I think those spots generally get underbluffed. So it's an aspect of general psychology, perceived range awareness combination, but it also interacts with textures and range versus range. This is just pre-flop spew. These environments don't 3-bet aggressively enough to incentivize you to call with low pocket pairs out of position. This is a spot where you're folding versus a volatility profile check raise. We just saw what that other guy did with the ace deuce. Like, this is what those guys do. He could be check raising anything merged from low pocket pair to backdoor flush draw to flush draws to 9x to ace 3. There's just no way that you can make this fold. It's way too assumptive in terms of what you would be ranging him for. And the very fact that he's a short stack already has me in a very high confidence for his profile that he's a volatility profile. This is a fold pre-flop. Probably call there with like 8s plus. Obviously this is conditional. If he's crazy 3-betting, go ahead and call 5s. But I think this is Bovada or Ignition that you're playing on. These pools have an average 3-bet from the blinds. From button versus big blind, the average 3-bet is like 10%. So think about it, what it is from UTG versus big blind. You're getting the picture that you really shouldn't be trying to go to the flop with low pocket pairs versus a range that's pushing so much equity to the flop. This is a spot that's spew call on the river. This is a bet fold, not a bet call. This is such a standard metric. Like, this is what I'm working on. If I do put out a new program, it's going to be like so much of it will be like the easiest win rate I could ever give you, because here's what we have now. Hopefully within the next few months, we will have strong support through huge data mined samples that literally bet calling on the river is negative EV with a bluff catcher. Like, that line is that consistently under bluffed that you don't even need to think anymore. All you need to ask yourself here is, do I dominate any portion of the villain's value range? If not, no, he's not bluffing, I need to fold it. And that might be where some guys get tripped up, and where I hear the insistence come in, and a player is like, he's like, well, what if he's just doing this with 8-7? But like, that in itself is pretty assumptive. For you to want to find the opportunity with your hand so greatly that now you put bottom 2 pair into your opponent's range, for him to be repolarizing. In environments where guys don't value bet thinly enough to begin with, that's an overarching trend, especially if they don't value raise thinly enough. That's the type of assumption that if you get caught in, it will cause you to justify distortional analysis and make a call where it's otherwise a clear fold. So what would the bottom of my calling range be here? I probably would fold even ace. I would maybe call ace 9, because I think it's more reasonable that he could be like sometimes raising like ace 8 or 9-8. But I really don't even feel that good about ace 9. And this holds true even versus volatility profiles. That's the other thing. Like, even the volatility profile doesn't really have a tendency to be bluff raising the river in spots, especially where your range is decently well protected. Here you are getting an indication that you're up against some sort of volatility profile based on this check raise sizing. Now you're calling turn versus a strange sizing bet for how this board is playing out. Like, what's going on? There's already a discordance. Okay, there's very few players that would understand that this is a bet sizing scheme that should exist in theory. With that being said, it's already becoming more likely that this player is someone who's functioning on a lower level of thinking, because it's just so rare that a portion of his range would play accurately with this sizing scheme. I'm not saying it's impossible, but what I'm doing is recognizing through balanced observations, the sizing that he's showing me, that this player is trending towards a confidence interval profile of someone who probably doesn't have good awareness over standard metric sizing schemes. Geometric growth of the pot with polarized ranges like probably being the most important one, especially on this turn. It starts to look a little bit sketchy what type of hands he could even be repping here, because it does make sense for him to check raise merged on a flop like this, but it doesn't make sense for him to go in with a half pot bet with like pocket sevens and pocket eights at any sort of real frequency, especially when this card is almost definitely better for your range. So this is where my sirens are going off like, oh, my confidence that this is a volatility profile is now going up and up. And what's my metric for that? I don't fold from turn to river because the volatility profile has such a high tendency of barreling off. If you're calling here to fold the river, basically what you're saying is I have such a good read on this player's profile that I arrogantly believe I can make really good hero folds because I have such lightning vision over how his range is going to break from turn to river. This is what I mean when I'm trying to get you familiar with the level of assumption that you're unconsciously functioning from. If you have the volatility profile, maybe you didn't even get that far in this hand, but if you have that, it really helps to solidify the metric you should be operating from, because we've simplified this shit. We know that we don't have to make tough decisions from turn to river when we have strong top pair. Once we've labeled someone a volatility profile, it's already integrated from massive amounts of data. This is what I want you guys to understand, like why these programs are so high caliber, ones that come from trickle down mass data analysis, is because it's everything that happens over extremely large samples distilled into simple line metrics, so that you can fly above the level of your analysis in spots where there's huge imbalances occurring in the environment. Because to go in and say, even though I know that this is a spot that is massively overbluffed by volatility profiles on the whole, I think this texture is actually one that I should fold. See the arrogance? It's like if I told you that 90% of spots were calls because of the imbalance of the environment, and then you're sitting at the table every single time in a spot like that trying to find the exceptions to the rule, you're naturally going to fuck yourself over. You'd be better off just auto-calling in those spots and not thinking that you are good enough at textural analysis or villain profile reads to be able to spot all the exceptions to the rule, and that's exactly what everybody's doing. It will be on YouTube after, to the guy who just asked that. So this is a clear call, and it's a clear call because I'm staying above the level of being like, oh, well, the flush got there now, or whatever the hell's going through your mind, to think that he wouldn't bluff this card aggressively. This is, again, paradigm awareness. The volatility profile is not nearly as... He's not nearly as well-versed in textural range versus range interaction in terms of, like, you know, how the board is interacting with the two ranges, because he's recreational, he doesn't care, and he's also forcing aggression like crazy. He also just has a higher base rate of bluffs to begin with on the turn, which makes it way easier for him to be imbalanced just by pulling triggers at random frequencies on the river. I use that example often of it's easier to slip on a banana on a racetrack that has 100 banana peels on it as opposed to 10. This guy has a lot of banana peels in his range on the turn. You like that one, Tim? It's so stupid, but I like Mario Kart. Standard volatility profile leak caused by assumptive ranging that believes itself to be well balanced. I'll call turn here to fold river because that seems to be where this hand might fall in my range. It's not even, like this is a clear river call in theory. Rounders asking how did we get a volatility profile on this guy? Just based on the fact that there's a suspicion in the line that he's playing where, like, yes, he could have a merge range here that makes a lot of sense. His sizing is already like kind of strange to me because we know that the fish just use like these wacky unorthodox sizings to begin with. Then he's polarizing on a card that's better for my range. So now it's like, it's weird for him to have 7s and 8s in this line. And even if he does have those hands, I'm beating them now. So now his line is just sort of incongruent or inconsistent with value. And so I'm not saying he can't have 4x or pocket 6s. I'm saying that when I see that the hands that he's repping are becoming more and more polarized, the hands that are ahead of me are more polarized, and they also don't really, the sizing sequence that he's using is sort of resembling that of a player who doesn't really know what the fuck he's doing. That's when I'm going to turn on the volatility switch and be like, okay, there's no point in trying to figure out why I would fold from turn to river here, because the confidence has reached a threshold that the volatility profile exists at a high enough rate where I'm pushing all in on that data point. If you guys understood how much your call efficiency would go up if you just correctly identified players who are operating within volatility profiles, you would understand how to raise your win rate like from 5 BBs to 10 BBs, especially in these soft unknown environments. Like, it's that dramatic of an increase because these are the biggest imbalances of the pool in the largest pots. If you're not playing effectively versus volatility profiles, you're leaving so much free money on the table. So again, when I go back to strategic development in terms of a coaching pattern, the things that become very interesting to me, okay, standard line metrics and training these guys how to play really efficiently versus volatility profiles from the start. Because to me, that's like a really strong system for very fast win rate development right off the bat. And it's something that I can distill and simplify into metrics that are integratable through pattern recognition and have very small exceptions to the overarching rules, so that within a week or two, I can prepare a player to deploy into an environment and know that he's going to soak up all the dead money from fish. That's really important because that's going to jack his win rate, which also gives him confidence, which also gives him more distilled and cleaner awareness because he's not stressed out, which is going to accelerate his learning pattern because he's going to feel more inspired to go and learn more. It all matters. So what I'm saying is getting a student off to a good start is as much of a courtesy as the coach can do because it will actually directly affect his ability to learn efficiently from that point on. If you had a student who went on a 20 buy-in downswing at the beginning of a course, that affects the progress of the course in one way or another. Either he's going to distrust the program, or he's going to be financially stressed, or he's just going to be stressed out that he's a loser and he can't figure this shit out for himself. It's not good to have self-doubt when you're trying to deploy into an independent learning pattern that requires you to feel empowered and able to turn on your own momentum from the day-to-day. Like, if you can't give yourself the permission to take feedback from your environment and spin it in a way that is productively focused, you're not going to make the strides that you could make if you could do that. And that's what disempowerment does to someone. It takes away the ability for him to reframe reality in a way that would be productive for him, no matter if reality is giving him positive or negative feedback. And that's why it's good to have a coach who looks at your hands, and if it was a bad run, I can say, don't worry, just keep doing what you're doing. And if it is that you're playing poorly, I can say, here's the corrections we need to make. Let's integrate them and move forward very quickly. Is the mic low? I actually think I'm on full blast. I am. Sorry about that. Okay. I'm just going to take some questions now because I think I've said about everything I want to say. I hope I've made my point in terms of taking a suggestion, especially for the guys that don't have the win rate that you want yet. If you're the type of guy who goes into a session review either with a friend or a coach and you come away with it with that frustrated stubbornness in you that's like, that guy didn't actually know what he was talking about. Maybe he doesn't, but you clearly fucking don't if you don't have the results you want. Over how many years have you been playing, or how many months have you been trying to recalibrate without a really winning month where everything felt like it was balanced and true to you? Like, if I could get through to you guys how much stubbornness I sense in the community in terms of people who think they know what they should be correcting, and then on top of that, guys who think they know but still don't have the work ethic to even like try, the whole thing is just sort of like, I'm going to say this on two levels. on one level, I'm like, I really wonder what percentage of the community is actually ready to excel. On another level, it's like I'm really excited about like the future of business just in general because I believe that the poker world is a pretty decent resemblance of as a microcosm of what bigger business is like in other markets. And if everybody's this fucking insistent and this fucking lazy and stubborn, business looks good from here on out for anybody who wants to take the humble path. I also have this dream, I told one of the CFP guys yesterday, where like, who knows if I'll ever do this, but if we do put something together that is really distilled and really simple and just very well organized, to just fucking put that shit out for like we were talking about putting it out for like really cheap, like stupid cheap. But I was like, what if we even just dropped it for like free? And it was just like the fuck you last statement of what I want to represent to the community, which is the bridge out of the suffering in this format of life. Like poker as a microcosm of life, learning about yourself, developing yourself. Everybody's trying to protect all this information, but like my whole thing the whole way through has been like, there's so much more potential in people just learning how to distill their own assumptions. Like I would hands down move all in on the idea that if the poker community, if 50% of the people in the poker community rose to the level of purity in their own ability to balance assumption that they could play super high stakes, like 10-20 crushers, the world would be such a better place, and then those guys would be able to network and branch off into bigger business, but like nobody has vision like that, so everybody's trying to control information. Like I would love to see a network of 100 really top-notch balanced guys that came from poker, form a group, and then go off into bigger business and really fucking develop something awesome for the world. That's always been my thing, is like, let's use poker as an apprenticeship to getting really fucking awesome at life skills and then go deploy from there. So my whole thing is like, I don't give a fuck if we put a product out for really cheap in the near future. If I feel like I have something that's super distilled, and I feel like if I feel like I have something that's simple enough that I know I can drop on someone who's a noob or someone from a really high level of ambition, then I'm down to do that just because of the potential that it has to bridge them out of the suffering that I know I went through for way too long in my 20s. And that's something I'm very interested in. Like, that's something I'm deeply connected to. So a lot of shit like is going around right now on the blogs. Like, Nick's courses are overpriced. Like, I'm trying to fucking make a living along the way. You guys have to understand that, just to be transparent. Like, I've started a business so I can coach people, and I don't really play that much anymore because all I do is coach. So yes, I have to put my products out for a price that I can still have a healthy living with. But eventually, when I get out of this and I try to leverage into something bigger, I'm going to drop a bomb on the community for something most likely very cheap to free, knowing that only 3% of the fuckers that even come across it will apply the work ethic to even get something out of it. Because there's a barrier to entry. This isn't just like a magic pill. There's 100 to 300 hours of integration that goes into programs like these. So yeah, just to be transparent, like that's sort of where I'm at. And the funny thing to me is at the end of the day, my most expensive program is $2,000, but it's a 12.5-hour program. Good luck getting private coaching for $170 or cheaper an hour that is as good as that. So the whole thing, the whole argument against my program doesn't really make much sense to me. Thanks to everyone who's giving support in the chat. I'm glad that you guys have been getting value out of the stuff that I've been talking about on the streams, especially since like November. I feel like we put some really good stuff out here. Just a quick update. I had a video scheduled to release on Run It Once, but we're moving toward more of like a professional video format. So it's going to take a little longer for me to put this new series out. I've hired a guy to do sort of pro PowerPoint presentations for me, and a lot of it's going to be on the more mental game side, like a lot of phone calls with people, but like it's going to be sort of organized into a PowerPoint format too, so there's something pretty to look at. So I'm pretty sure that's going to be like an 8 to 12 part series that starts sometime in the next 4 to 6 weeks, and then we'll sort of run through the summer. Yeah, thanks for coming out, Junior. I appreciate you submitting the hands. Last question. If you could go back and give 20-year-old Nick advice, what would you tell him? I've answered this question before, actually, and I still like my answer. I said I would tell myself to trust myself beyond reason, because reasoning is what held me back for so long in my own contracted level of insistence. I would trust myself to admit to myself that something was wrong earlier on and that I needed to make a course correction. And then I wouldn't listen to whatever anybody else fucking said, because ultimately they're operating from patterns that society has conditioned them into, and if it's not getting results, it's not working. So I think a lot of life, I put this in my blog too, is about like, for me at least, especially where I feel like the relevance of my journey is headed, like I have to be one who leads if I'm going to be able to offer something of value, and that includes to myself. So it's like going first. You have to be willing to make the call that it's okay to head in a new direction when everyone else is saying no, that doesn't make sense. You get to a point where, and I'm there, in no way am I there yet, because I still am susceptible to criticism and negativity. I just feel the pain and just keep forging through. Like that's what the difference between I think me and someone who would just be crippled by it. I feel it and it hurts me, but I keep going. But I think the difference at the end of the day is you'll get to a point where you're such a king, like you're so independent in your level of thinking that the whole world could point a finger at you and say no, and you would know that you still have to go in the direction that your intuition is telling you. I think if you can get to that place, you're like untouchable. And then you can really start to offer value, because the type of visionary leadership that you can offer is like unprecedented. And I think there have been people like that, and that's sort of what I aspire to. Okay, that's it. Got some other stuff I gotta go do. Thanks to everybody for coming out. I think there's a storm on the 30th. I'll update the schedule when I know for sure. Also going to start a new blog, because that blog is way too long. It takes way too long to load. So I'm going to start a new one with kind of a different theme, I think. I'm going to go to Europe and sort of sit with it. I'm not sure exactly what direction I want to go, but it's going to have a little bit different of a vibe to it. So I'll think about that and I'll get back to you guys. Thanks for everybody for coming out. Peace.